The International Court of Justice has issued an order in favor of Qatar in the case that the Gulf nation brought against the United Arab Emirates. Now, the court says the measures taken by the UAE in the blockade against Qatar amount to racial discrimination. It has ordered the UAE to allow Qatari families to be reunited. It also says students must be permitted to finish their education in the country. Qataris affected should be given access to courts and tribunals. The UAE is one of 4 countries that imposed an air, land, and sea blockade against Qatar more than a year ago now, and it sparked the worst political crisis in the Gulf in decades. Now, here is some of what the UN's top court had to say.
The court notes that a number of consequences apparently resulted from this situation, and that the impact on those affected seem to persist to this date. UAE Qatari mixed families have been separated. Qatari students have been deprived of the opportunity to complete their education in the UAE, and Qataris have been denied equal access to tribunals and other judicial organs in the UAE.
Neve Barker is in The Hague. Let's go to him live now. So, Neve, this was actually a very, very close vote, but by no means a unanimous decision from this court. Tell us more about what happened.
Yes, it was very close indeed. Well, the court has had about a month to consider the claims and counterclaims made by Qatar and the UAE that were first presented here at the end of June. But narrowly, they have given Qatar a chance to allow for provisional measures to be introduced, which is exactly what Qatar wanted. Now, just to explain what provisional measures is, it's a interim directive by the UN's highest court that is immediate and is legally binding to all signatories of that key convention, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, that the UAE is accused of violating. And the UAE now has to make sure that families are no longer separated, that students who have been denied access to their education can continue their studies or at least have the documents to go elsewhere, that people can also now access judicial services, and a key message to both the UAE and Qatar that everything possible should be done to avoid an escalation of tensions any further.
Okay, Neve Barker live there in The Hague. That's just one angle of this very important story. We have several more to cover as well. Neve, thank you. So let's take you to the heart of what this case was. At the core of it are accusations by Qatar that the United Arab Emirates has discriminated against its citizens under the Interventional Convention Against Racism. Qatar says that its citizens have been illegally expelled from the UAE and stopped from traveling to or passing through the country. Qatar presented evidence that families have been kept apart and its citizens denied medical records and other services like education since this blockade was imposed in June of last year. That, Qatar argues, is a human rights violation. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bahrain are implementing the air, sea, and land embargo. They say that Qatar funds terrorism, which Doha strongly denies. The UAE is one of only one of 4 that's a signatory to the Convention Against Racism, and that's why its role was it was the sole subject of this case. William Worcester is a senior lecturer at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. He joins us now from The Hague. We appreciate your time very much. So this ruling in favor of Qatar, ordering UAE to do these very specified things, what enforcement is there to make sure the UAE actually does this?
Well, luckily, we don't normally need enforcement. Usually what happens is states comply. 99% of the time states will comply because it's in their interest to be seen as a trustworthy state. But if for some reason that were to happen and a state were not to comply, the other state could always go to the UN Security Council. But luckily, that's never had to happen.
What was the bar that Qatar had to meet to prove this discrimination, to prove racism?
Well, at this point, the case is only a provisional measures order. So the overall case of whether or not there is or is not discrimination has not yet been decided, and that may be some time before that happens. Today, they just had to show that there was an emergency need to make sure that people's lives are not going to be interrupted. So all the court had to decide today was that there was a plausible argument that there may be discrimination on the basis of essentially of race or ethnic heritage.
So what type, and I understand what you're saying, that this is still provisional, there's still a very long process here, but still having said that, what type of legal precedent does this set?
Well, it establishes not a very big precedent for international law in the sense that this is just a provisional measures order, so the overall case hasn't been decided. There are two other cases on this same treaty. One has been already dismissed on a procedural ground and the other one is still pending. So we don't have a whole lot of precedent. So if indeed this were to go in the favor of Qatar, then we would have a really strong statement that this kind of action would be considered racial discrimination.
So does this give if there were any families, that wanted to pursue some sort of legal claim for losses or damages, does this give them something that they could use, something that they could reference?
If what you're meaning is whether or not an individual could bring some particular claims, that's not going to happen.
No, not to this. Let me clarify.
Not to them not to discriminate.
Yeah, not to this particular body. That's not what I mean.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not how this court works. But I'm saying if there was some other court, some other jurisdiction where a family that had been affected by this wanted to file a lawsuit, for example, is this something that could work in their favor?
Well, they'd have to find a court that would actually have jurisdiction over this. So that would have to be, say, a court in the Emirates or potentially a court in Qatar. There are some human rights treaty bodies. There is a claim already pending at the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination. So there are a couple of venues where that could happen. For this, the precedent, and of course we're talking about when the overall case is done, the precedent would be that this kind of discrimination, which really on its face looks more like citizenship discrimination, that this kind of discrimination would constitute racial discrimination and thus trigger the treaty. Then the question would be, whatever other court you go to, whether it be a domestic court or it be one of these treaty bodies, if they also can enforce the same convention, then indeed they could look to this as a persuasive precedent.
Okay. Well, again, the UAE has been ordered to do very specific things, reunite families, to allow the students to continue studying and to give Qataris affected by this access to judicial recourse. So we will have to see how this plays out. William Worcester joining us from The Hague. Thank you very much.